There's a big difference between being alive during the American Revolution and serving during the American Revolution. Okay, now I accidentally hit the stop button and then started it just a moment ago. You saw that little flutter, that little hesitation. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to number the second video, video number 2, and I'm going to number this one, the one that I'm speaking on right now, as video 2A to keep from confusing everything. All right. Monroe probably was a man who was behind his time, right? He really was unable to cope with the new economic realities of the time period. Um, the idea of a national bank, the idea of the protective tariff, the argument that swirled around um, who should pay for internal improvements. What Monroe did, and it seems that Monroe was rather aware of his shortcomings. I think he realized that he was not the equivalent of a Jefferson or a Madison. But he was smart enough to figure out that he needed to put smart men in positions of responsibility. And so he surrounded himself by young Republican leaders. Let me give you some names. John Quincy Adams. Monroe named John Quincy Adams as his Secretary of State. Monroe named John C. Calhoun of South Carolina to be his Secretary of War. So he was putting really competent, really intelligent people in charge of important areas of the government. The nation was at peace when Monroe becomes the president in 1817. There was a growing economy. We've talked about this already. As a matter of fact, uh, a Boston newspaper referred to it in an article as the era of good feelings. And that name sort of stuck, the era of good feelings. But honestly, it was not all as good as it might have seemed on the surface. The Federalist Party, for example, was falling apart at the seams. Uh, and you'd have thought that the Republican Party then would have been become stronger, but that is not necessarily the case. The Republican Party had problems of their own. There were internal tensions in the Republican Party, and in many ways, it was because American society was changing. Uh, the societal order became more stratified. In other words, uh, Americans became more different from each other, uh, especially uh, economically, politically. They became much more stratified due to economic growth and due to westward expansion. There were a lot of differences between Americans. There was no longer, if there had ever been, I don't think there ever was any such thing as an American, one American. But it really became obvious by 1817, 1818 that America was in fact becoming more and more stratified. But all of it was generally good, right? I mean, if you have enough time, you could pick any society apart. But generally, it really was an era of good feelings. As a matter of fact, it was Americans felt so good about themselves that in 1820, when Monroe became eligible for re-election, he was elected with very little opposition. The Federalist Party did not even run a candidate against Monroe. Monroe got all of the electoral votes that were available, uh, except for four. Uh, three of the members of the Electoral College abstained from voting to avoid giving Monroe a clean sweep. And one of the candidates voted for, and one of the electors, I'm sorry, one of the members of the Electoral College voted for John Quincy Adams for the same reason, to keep uh, Monroe from getting all of the electoral votes. Now, some of the problems that the Monroe administration had were diplomatic problems. Diplomatic developments. Remember, within a generation and a half, we fought two wars with England, the most powerful nation, the most powerful economy, most powerful political system in the entire world, and yet we have defeated them twice. Now, it took quite a bit of luck to do that, but nevertheless, at least on paper, we have defeated the English twice. Now, diplomatic developments between the two nations resulted in an ever more close relationship between the two countries. Remember that the United States had been a colony of England. Uh, America had been a colony of the British Empire. But we had so much in common with the British that perhaps some of these other British colonies did not have. We shared a common language, right? English. Most Americans, at least in the early days of the nation, were Protestants. And of course, that was a British trait. Um, the Americans generally used the British legal system of common law, uh, with one exception, and that was, of course, the state of Louisiana that came into the Union in 1812. Part of its legal system was was based on the old French Napoleonic code, while a part of its legal system was based on the British common law. But generally, America shared the legal system with the British as well. So there were more things that united us than separated us. And as a result, once the War of 1812 ended in 1815, never again would the British and the Americans go to war with each other. Now, did we always agree on everything? Of course not. But we would never disagree in the future to the point where we would start fighting each other. Never again. American shippers, for example, almost immediately after the war, after the end of the War of 1812, both the British resumed shipping to the United States, and the United States resumed shipping to England as well. And there were two important agreements. Now, no, let's do it like this. The treaty that ended the War of 1812 was the Treaty of Ghent, Ghent. Ghent is a city in the nation of Belgium, where that treaty was negotiated between the British and the Americans. Now, The Treaty of Ghent didn't really do a lot. It stopped the war. I mean, that's a great thing, right? But it did very little else. It didn't. Both sides freed any prisoners that they might have taken, right? Um, that's about it. So there were some unresolved issues between the United States and the British that needed to be addressed, that needed to be taken care of, that had not been addressed in the Treaty of Ghent that actually ended the war. In 1817, one of those problem areas was resolved finally. The Rush-Bagot Agreement of 1817. Let me spell that one. Bagot, Bagot. The Rush-Bagot Agreement of 1817 limited naval forces on the Great Lakes. Fundamentally, uh, the Great Lakes were demilitarized by the United States and Great Britain. Both nations agreed that they would not put warships up there. About the only thing that came close to being a warship that was put by either side on the Great Lakes were Coast Guard vessels whose purpose it was to stop smuggling from Canada, which was owned by England, right? From Canada into the United States, and then the opposite direction as well from the United States into uh, Canada. The result of the Rush-Bagot Agreement of 1817 was the longest unfortified border in the entire world. If you look at that border between the United States and Canada, it runs from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean, and it is long. It is the longest unfortified border. Now, I don't know if we can still say that it's unfortified because of terrorists and the possibility of terrorists crossing that unfortified border from Canada into the United States and attacking us here. I don't know if it has been uh, fortified to a greater degree since the age of terrorism, but I do know that before then it was the longest unfortified border in the world. Now, another uh, act of diplomacy that really needed to be addressed in the Treaty of Ghent, but which wasn't, was the Convention of 1818. The Convention of 1818. That's another word for treaty, right? The Treaty of 1818. Now, I want you to think about this, give this some serious thought for just a moment. While the United States, before the United States came into existence, the United States was a colony of England. And so there really was no need to determine what the boundary was between the colonies and Canada because we were all owned by the British. But now the United States is an independent nation. And now it becomes important that the northern border of the United States be specifically known. The southern border of Canada, the northern border of the United States, same thing, right? We need to be able to define what that border is. Well, the Convention of 1818 in many ways settled that issue. Um, it made it very clear where the boundary line was between the United States and British Canada. Um, so if it had done nothing else, that would have been a great accomplishment right there. We now know where the border is. But there was more. During this very time, no, let me do it like this. Traditionally, back in those days, whichever country, whichever European country uh, discovered a new country, a new area, a new part of the world, it was tradition for the explorers to claim that area in the name of their king or queen. Well, uh, the United States had sent explorers uh, after the Louisiana Purchase had been negotiated between the United States and France. Thomas Jefferson had sent American explorers. Remember the Lewis and Clark expedition? He had sent explorers into the new northwest of the United States. The problem, of course, was that the British had been exploring roughly the same area from the different direction. And so it winds up that both England and the United States are now claiming the same territory for their different countries. And that territory is what is called the Oregon Territory, which at that time, included the present day state of Washington as well. Okay. Now, normally, when two nations claimed the same territory, the result was inevitable, and that was that they would go to war over that land, and the person who won the war would win the land. But with regard to uh, Oregon, the Convention of 1818 decided that both nations, that England and the United States, would jointly occupy Oregon. In other words, they would both claim it. It would be jointly occupied, but that its boundary would remain sort of nebulous, sort of undecided. And it's an indication of how close the two nations were, that they never really did consider going to war over Oregon. They said to themselves, "This is something that friends can work out." Also, in the Convention of 1818, the British government um, acknowledged again that Americans had fishing rights off the coast of Newfoundland and Labrador in Canada. So here's the story. Back when we were an American colony, since the Canadians and the Americans were both Englishmen, right? They fished wherever they wanted to in the northern Atlantic Ocean, including uh, near the island of Newfoundland, and Labrador. But now things have changed. The United States is an independent nation, and uh, in the uh, in the Treaty of Paris that ended the American Revolution, the British very magnanimously gave to the Americans the right to continue to fish basically in Canadian territory off the coast of these Canadian islands of Newfoundland and Labrador. And in the Convention of 1818, the right to fish in those same places was reaffirmed by the British. The Americans could continue to fish off these islands. Now, there was one area in which there was no agreement. There weren't big arguments, but there were certainly no agreements either. The chief remaining obstacle was England's continued refusal to permit American shippers access to the West Indies. Now, let me give you the story behind that also. Back when we were an American colony, American colonial ships sailed to all of the British possessions, including some of the really rich islands that were located in the Caribbean, places like Barbados and Jamaica. But once the American Revolution and Americans were getting rich by trading in what's referred to uh, as the West Indies, the economies of the West Indies were slavery based economies, mostly sugar. That was the main crop uh, that was raised in the West Indies. And sugar was extraordinarily profitable. As a matter of fact, the stories are told that the sugar plantation owners they didn't save any land for even a front or a backyard. They literally planted sugarcane up to the front and the back doorsteps because land meant money. Now, as a matter of fact, the Western Indies property owners uh, didn't even try to raise the food to feed their own slaves because by doing that, they were actually losing money. They could make so what they did, they devoted every square inch of land to raising sugar. Then they turned right around and they bought from other places the food that it takes to feed the slaves. And even having uh, bought the food for the slaves, they still came out ahead. They still made money on the proposition. Now, if you look at a map of the Western Hemisphere, you'll notice that the nearest largest nation of any size to the Western Indies is the British American colonies, and then later uh, the United States. So the, the the West Indian property owners bought most of their food during our colonial period from American farmers, and the American farmers were just making a killing. And then the American Revolution takes place, and the United States wins. Now, what happens at that point is that the British decide that they are going to buy food to feed the slaves from other British subjects, but not from the Americans. And so the Americans are cut out of the food market for the Western Indian slave plantations. And of course, that means a huge loss of income for American farmers. And from the very day that the British cut us off from selling food to the West Indies, the Americans have attempted to change the minds of the British government, and they have been unable to do so. The British government is willing in many ways to go along and get along with the Americans, but not in this area. The British continued to refuse to permit American shippers to ship food to the West Indies. And this would become, now, it's never going to get serious enough to where the two countries go to war with each other. That's never going to happen. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't cause hard feelings. And this is going to be an area of tension between the United States and the British for years and years and years to come. But we have two treaties during this rough period between the British and the Americans. Remember what they are: the Rush-Bagot Agreement of 1817, which uh, clears all military presence from the Great Lakes. The only thing that's left behind is the Coast Guard. whose purpose it is to guard against smuggling. And the second is the Convention of 1818, which has several parts. Uh, it determined the northern boundary of the United States, the boundary between the United States and England. Between the United States and Canada, which is owned by England at that time. They agreed to the joint occupation of the Oregon Territory. The British continue to extend fishing rights to the American fishing fleet uh, in eastern Canada near the islands of Newfoundland and Labrador. The only thing that the Americans don't get that they really want is uh, the British permission to trade with the West Indies. Okay. Now, England is not the only country that we are dealing with diplomatically, though. Another of the nations is Spain. Now, Spain found itself in a rather sad predicament, honestly, uh, in the beginning of the 1800s. At one time, Spain had the largest European empire of any uh, European country. I mean, think of what Spain owned at one time. They owned much of North America. They owned all of Central America. They owned all of South America except for Brazil. They owned some of the richest islands in the Caribbean. I mean, they owned places like Jamaica. Now, they lost it to England. At one time, they owned Jamaica. They owned Cuba. They owned a number of these really small but very wealthy sugar islands. They owned the Philippines over in the Pacific. They even owned parts of India, which most people don't even know about. All right, that's what that's what Spain at one time owned, and then Napoleon Bonaparte comes along, and Napoleon, first of all, starts invading all of his neighbors, his European neighbors, and one neighbor is Spain. Spain and France butt up against each other, don't they? Napoleon invades and conquers Spain. By this time, Spain is a rather weak nation anyway, and now they've got to deal with Napoleon and the French. So the Spanish are just barely in a position to resist the French, much less do they have the ability to hold on to their old huge empire. Well, it doesn't take many years before the people who live, for example, in South and Central America, it doesn't take too long for them to realize that they can get away with declaring their independence from Spain. Spain won't like it, but there's nothing that Spain can do about it as long as the French are controlling Spain. So, one by one, the nations that had previously comprised the Spanish Empire around the world, they began to declare their independence from Spain. Places like Mexico declare their independence. Uh, Places like Argentina. Almost everywhere that you look on a map of the Western Hemisphere, if it had been owned by Spain previously, it was now independent. There were a few exceptions, and we'll talk about those when we get to them. Now, there is one part of the world that had been owned by Spain that I didn't mention, and I didn't mention it intentionally because I wanted to concentrate on it now. We had said that the Spanish at one time had owned large parts of North America. That's true. Many of us, when we think about that, we think about California, and that is true. But one of the places that were owned by the Spanish that we don't quite give enough attention to is the fact that Florida was originally owned by the Spanish. It was originally settled by the Spanish, and it was peopled by the Spanish. The same problem, though, exists with regard to Spanish Florida that existed with regard to Spanish Mexico or Spanish Argentina or Spanish whatever. The Spanish presence in Florida became so weak that the people who lived in Florida began to realize that they could pretty much do what they wanted to, and there would be no repercussions from the Spanish government. So there was internal revolt in Spanish Florida against the government, um, and there was just this general revolt almost everywhere against the Spanish government. As a matter of fact, so weak had the Spanish government become that the Spanish were unable to enforce its obligations to the United States under Pinkness Treaty of 1795. Remember Pinkness Treaty? A very favorable treaty that had been negotiated uh, by John Adams, by the John Adams administration in 1795. One of the things that the United States had promised the Spanish they would help them do was to pacify the Indians along the border between the United States and Spanish Florida. But the Spanish were so weak. Look, some of these Spanish soldiers literally were walking around in rags because, well, they hadn't received a paycheck in years. They were stranded in North America with no way to get back to Spain. Many of them were starving to death. Discipline had broken down between the officers and the enlisted men. It was a terrible situation to be in. And starting in 1816, skirmishes began to occur between the Seminole Indians of Florida and the American settlers who had begun to move into Florida. Now, the Spanish did not like these foreign countries, the citizens of these foreign countries, from moving into Florida. But once again, there was nothing they could do about it. Many of the Americans moved into Florida for some really good reasons. If you were a person who did not like to be told what to do by the government, Florida was the perfect place for you because you were no longer in the United States, and so United States law did not apply to you. And um, the Spanish government was so weak that they could not enforce any laws, and so you were on your own. Skirmishes began to occur when the Seminole Indians began to realize that the Spanish government was no longer in a position to control the Indians. They began to uh, raid both the Spanish soldiers and the American settlers who who had moved into Spanish Florida. And in 1817, uh, the American Secretary of War, John C. Calhoun, sent Andrew Jackson on a campaign against the Seminoles. Now, this is the same Andrew Jackson who was the hero of the Battle of New Orleans back in 1815. It's 2 years later. Calhoun sends Jackson on a campaign against the Seminole Indians in an attempt to stop the Seminoles from attacking the American citizens who had voluntarily left the United States. Now, you tell me, why did the United States feel any obligation to these people? They are the ones who had voluntarily left the United States. And be that as it may, we felt an obligation to protect them, and so Jackson is sent uh, to deal with the Seminoles. Now, Jackson had some specific orders from John C. Calhoun, the Secretary of War. He could enter Florida. In other words, he could invade a foreign nation because that's what he was ordered to do. Florida is owned by us today, but not in 1817. Florida was owned by the Spanish, and nothing that the United States did could change that fact. And when Jackson was given orders to invade Florida, he was being given orders to invade a foreign nation. You don't have to like it. It is true though. Jackson was ordered to enter Florida, but he could not attack any Spanish forts or positions or posts. And of course, Jackson immediately ignored that order. He attacked the Spanish fort. He did that. He fought some Seminoles as well. He hung two of the Indian leaders. But what came close? Remember, I've said several times that at no point after the War of 1812 did the Americans and the British go to war again. Well, it came close. It came close because when Jackson invades Florida, he discovers that there are two British officers there in Florida who had offered military training to the Seminoles. So how does Jackson, remember, Jackson has orders not to mess with anybody except for the Seminoles. What does he do? He hangs one of the British officers and he shoots the other. So he's got two dead British soldiers on his hands now. Uh, as a result of all this action on the part of Jackson, the Florida Panhandle was pretty much in American hands by the year 1818, even though that was not the purpose of Jackson's invasion. Now, what were the reactions to Jackson's campaign there in Florida? Well, the capital of Spain was, at that time, and still is, Madrid. And the fact that Jackson had invaded Spain angered the government in Madrid and was causing the city of Washington was causing the American capital to be very concerned about Jackson's action. Spain demanded the return of all territory that had been taken by the Americans. They demanded reparations. Now, that's a fancy word that means you need to pay us back for our stuff that you've destroyed, right? Reparations. And they demanded that Jackson be punished for his action. Now, let's talk about the reality of what was going on at that time. Spain was too weak. They could demand all they wanted to. They could be righteously indignant, right? The reality is that the nation of Spain could not find its way out of a wet paper bag. They could demand all this stuff, But could they force the United States to do it? And of course, the answer is no. They couldn't force America to do anything. Now, let's throw something else into this story. Publicly, Calhoun wanted to discipline Jackson. Calhoun and Jackson had never gotten along with each other in the past. And Calhoun saw this as an opportunity to publicly discipline Jackson. But Calhoun had some private feelings here as well. So he had the public feelings were, let's discipline Jackson for disobeying orders. But his personal feelings was that Calhoun was sort of glad that all this had happened. Um, Calhoun always saw Florida. Remember what Calhoun was. He was a Southerner. And remember what else he was. He was a Southern slave owner. And guess what else he was? He was a Southern slave owner who supported the expansion of slavery. Now, under Spanish rule, Florida had never been, slavery had never existed in Florida. Calhoun saw Florida as an opportunity to expand the institution of slavery. But it could only be done if Florida belonged to the United States. So Calhoun has this public persona of wanting to discipline Jackson for invading Florida, but he has this private idea that what Jackson did in invading Florida was the best thing that could have happened to expand the institution of slavery. Now, let's talk about reality again. We talked about reality earlier. We said that the Spanish were in no position to make the United States do anything. That was the reality. Here's another reality. Jackson was so popular that he was really invulnerable to punishment. I mean, you don't take the guy who's the hero of the Battle of New Orleans um, and 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 punish him in public. Just isn't done. So how was this resolved? Well, the United States forces withdrew from Florida, but everybody knew. I mean, everybody knew that they had left Florida voluntarily. Nobody had forced them to leave. Everyone knew that they could return to Florida anytime they chose to, and they could do what they wanted to do if they chose to do so. Now, all of this leads up to a treaty called the Transcontinental Treaty of 1819. The Transcontinental Treaty of 1819. Remember, I told you that Monroe had named young, bright men into positions of responsibility in his administration, and one of those men was a man by the name of John Quincy Adams, who happened to be the son of former President John Adams. Quincy Adams was brilliant and uh, had a lot of experience with diplomatic areas because when he was a young man, as a matter of fact, when he was a teenager, while his father was the ambassador to England, the ambassador to France, John Quincy Adams had served his father as his father's personal secretary. So everything that John Adams knew, John Quincy Adams knew. So John Quincy Adams had a very firm foundation in diplomacy. He knew how it worked. And now he is the nation's chief diplomat. He is the Secretary of State. In 1819, Secretary of State John Quincy Adams made a treaty with Spain, and the purpose of the treaty was to acquire Florida for the possession of the United States. And Spain is realistic enough to understand that the United States is either going to take it by using a treaty or they're going to take it by just taking it. And there's nothing that the Spanish can do. And so the Spanish, to save face, to save their pride, fundamentally, the Spanish sell Florida to the United States for $5 million of claims that were being held against Spain. In other words, Spain and Spanish companies and Spanish individuals owed the United States about $5 million. And so the way this would be handled, all of those debts would be forgiven, and the slate would be wiped clean. So Spain cedes, C-E-D-E-D, Spain ceded to the United States all of Florida in return for $5 million of American claims against Spain to be paid by the United States government. So there were two tools that were used to make Florida an American territory. Two things. There was, first of all, the treaty, and then there was the cash. As a result of the Transcontinental Treaty of 1819, for the first time ever, the United States' southern boundary was the Gulf of Mexico. Many of my students are always surprised. I'll say, okay, now, what was the northern boundary of the United States? Well, it was the southern boundary of Canada. All right, that's good. What was the western boundary of the United States? Well, it was the Mississippi River. Yeah, that's true. What was the eastern boundary of the United States? Well, it was the Atlantic Ocean. Okay, what it was the southern boundary of the United States? Well, the Gulf of Mexico. Wrong. Not at the beginning. The southern boundary, until the Transcontinental Treaty of 1819, the southern boundary of the United States was the northern boundary of Spanish Florida. Only after the Transcontinental Treaty of 1819 was written and was approved by the U.S. Senate, did the southern boundary of the United States finally become the Gulf of Mexico the way it is today. Now, something else that the Transcontinental Treaty does that we don't hear much of, the Spanish also had a very slight claim to the Oregon Territory. Remember, we said that um, the uh, the Convention of 1818 did several things. One of which was to the British and the Americans jointly claimed Oregon. Well, there was another European nation that had a much weaker claim, but nevertheless had a claim to the Oregon Territory, and that was Spain. Um, but when the United States and the Spanish signed the Transcontinental Treaty of 1819, it specifically took Spain out of the picture, and Spain drops all claims, no matter how nebulous, no matter how small they are. They drop all claims to the Oregon Territory. But there was another country who had a strong claim to the Oregon Territory that we don't think about too much. It was the Russians. It was the Russian Empire. I hope that you know that in the 1860s, the United States buys Alaska from who? Yeah, from Russia. If you look at a map of the northern hemisphere, you'll see that uh, that that Russia extends from the northeast part of Asia across the Strait of the Bering Strait into North America, and that part that we now call Alaska, pardon me, uh, was legitimately owned by the Russians. But the Russians also claimed a lot of land further south than the present day location of Alaska. They claimed down into the state of Washington, the present day state of Washington, as well as the present day state of Oregon. Not all of it, but the part of it that was on the Pacific coast. And it was not just a claim; it was a pretty legitimate claim. As a matter of fact, some historians say that the Russian claim to Oregon and Washington was actually stronger than the English and the American claim to Washington and Oregon. In 1821, Russia made the claim uh, that they owned all of the land down to the 51st parallel. Look on a map, find that 51st parallel, that line that runs east and west, and that is as far south as the Russians claimed to own the 51st parallel. Adams, our Secretary of State, let the Russians know in no uncertain terms that the United States felt that the American continents were no longer subject to further European colonization. His protest, John Quincy Adams' protest, resulted in a treaty between the Russians and the Americans in 1824, in which the Russians agreed that the southern limits of its possession would be 54 degrees 40 minutes south. In other words, quite a bit north of uh, the 51st parallel. Oregon was south of that line. Okay, so this makes the United States very happy. In 1825, the Russians signed a similar treaty with the British. Remember, the British and the Americans are claiming to own that land jointly. The Russians have dealt successfully now with the Americans. Now they've got to deal in a similar fashion with the English, and they do in 1825. With Russia now out of the picture, Oregon was still liable for the joint occupation of by England and the United States under the 1818 treaty agreement. Now, it doesn't change the fact that the Russians still own Alaska. But their property no longer extends down into what is now the lower 48 states, like they had claimed it. Now let's talk about the Monroe Doctrine for just a few moments. As a matter of fact, let's don't. Okay. Okay. This lecture has two parts. Right. I started it, and I told you that I was going to call it Lecture Two. Pardon me. And then I accidentally stopped the recording, and then I restarted it, and I don't know how long that was. 4, 5, 6 minutes. Really, I don't know. I'll have to go back and look. But I can't look at it on the fly here. But nevertheless, what I said was that I would divide this lecture into two parts. There would be what we're calling Lecture Two, and then this one I'm speaking on right now. We're going to call it Lecture 2A. So we've actually got three lectures, but we're going to call them number one, number two, number 2A. And the next time we start again, uh, that will start with lecture number 3. All right. I'll see you soon.